I will take you with me. You might learn something.
About soccer?
Nah, mate. Not about soccer. And for fuck's sake, stop saying soccer!
You know, the stories of, taking those slightly manky-looking Cuban oranges to Karl-Marx-City and throwing your leftover fruit, BFC fans throwing their leftover fruit at fans of rival teams. So, yeah, I think, that there's a really...
Who didn't have access to that fruit?
Yeah, who didn't have access to that fruit, exactly.
So
because
the
the supplies
gesture
were
of
better.
pure arrogance. Yes.
Yeah, like the arrogance of it, exactly.
Welcome back if you're a seasoned listener, and welcome very much, especially if this is the first episode you're listening to. Welcome to Season 2 of The Assistant Professor of Football, the niche podcast that explores the politics, cultures, histories, and traditions of the beautiful game, beyond the headlines and the game weeks, and beyond the transfer of superstars to the MLS, or to Saudi Arabia, or to Chelsea, whatever. Before we explore the fall of the German Democratic Republic through the lens of its serial champion, Berliner FC Dynamo, a word to the wise, thank you to all of you who provided me feedback as a rating on Apple or Spotify. By the way, please do so now while I do the housekeeping. It just takes a few seconds. Better yet, as a comment, and even better as a recommendation to your friends or a message to me. I'm exploring some ways to leave me comments more easily. Hoping to set up a way for you to leave me an audio message that I can play on the show as well, if you want that. In the meantime, there's Twitter, Facebook, Threads, all under the Assistant Professor of Football. I started this because I thought there would be a community of you all, well-educated soccer and football fans out there. And of course there is. So thank you for being here again and listening in and helping me bridge my own European past and North American present. Between the late 1970s and the late 1980s, Dynamo Berlin, a club closely associated with the communist East German Republic secret police, won the country's title 10 consecutive times. The hatred of the team across the country united Dynamo's fans, but it also provided the perhaps most prominent kind of complaint or grumbling that the GDR citizens had against the regime that ruled them. In 1989, that regime crumbled and fell, and so did Dynamo. Alan McDougall is a historian at the University of Guelph in Canada. He has written The People's Game, Football, State and Society in East Germany, which is a book you should buy, I think. And he takes us on a wild ride through a nation that is no more, with a club that polarizes German football to this day. Interspersed with the episode, I will play some music which I like, and I think you like as well. So there's 3 punk songs from East Germany before the wall came down, and 1 BFC Dynamo anthem as well, along the same kind of musical style. So you can watch out for that, and the links to those are in the show notes. It's good to be back, and I'd love to hear from you. And now, on to Berlin, before the wall came down. Welcome, Alan. Thank you. I'm very honored to have you on as visiting professor today. Before we travel to East Berlin and to Dresden before the wall came down, the obvious question, you are a Brit who teaches in Canada and writes mostly about East German soccer. How come?
Well, I mean, it started for me as a love for football, as somebody who played and watched the game. I grew up in England in the, 70s and 80s. The 80s was really sort of when I really started to fall in love with football. I played football competitively at a fairly decent level. As a kid, I was on the books at Tottenham Hotspur in North London. So I was a fairly decent footballer. Then at a certain point, you have to choose between the small chance of becoming a professional footballer and getting a decent education. So I kind of stopped playing football really seriously and, concentrated on education. But I guess football was always my first love. And anyway, to fast forward a bit, I went on to do graduate studies, including a PhD, in which I took an interest in East Germany during the Cold War. I wrote my PhD on the Freie Deutsche Jugend, the Free German Youth, the Communist Youth Organization. Got a position, luckily, as a tenured professor here in Canada at the University of Guelph, and I needed a second project to work on. Obviously, I was an East German scholar, but really I was above all a football fan. So I thought, I'll write a history of East German football. So that's kind of how the personal and the career came together for me. And I ended up writing a book on East German football. I've written another one on the history of global football, and I'm currently taking my vanity projects to extreme and writing a social history of my own club, Liverpool, from Shankly through to our very own Jurgen Klopp. So yes, that's kind of how I combined what I loved as a kid with what I like to write about now.
So just to clarify this, you were on the books at Tottenham, but you are a Liverpool fan. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I grew up in the southeast of England. My dad was he's from Liverpool, but he settled in the south eventually, and so there weren't any big clubs in my hometown. So decent young players tended to be headhunted, if you like, by London clubs. So so I was at Tottenham for a few years until I was about 15 or 16.
Any regret that you didn't break through all the way to the professionals and chose an academic career instead?
Yeah, I think I played the percentages correctly in the end. But there are days when I think, because a few people I knew went on to become professional players. And you think, well, like I said, I've been wealthier. But would I have been happier? I doubt it.
I think you're onto something there. Yes. I think it's fair to say that when people in England or in America think about East German soccer, the hype around Union Berlin, now in the Bundesliga, might come to mind. And even in Germany, I think the standard narrative is still that German football history is essentially West German football history, right? It's Beckenbauer, it's the Federal Republic, and then there's this East German annex that comes in the 90s and kind of gets subsumed and folded into the whole. Why write about East German soccer history in the first place, and what does it have to tell us that other comparable football histories of the same time period don't?
Yeah. Well, I think to go back to the first one, I think you're exactly right that the history of East German football is really the forgotten history of German football. I was at a conference last year actually in Germany, and it was an excellent conference, but it struck me as we were doing the kind of roundup at the end of the discussions and the papers that not a single person had presented on a former East German club. It was a very Western-centric kind of order of participation. And so that, I think, speaks to what you say that about the sort of erasure or forgetting of East German football history. Aside from, as you mentioned, I think Union Berlin, who've become the sort of Eastern version of St. Pauli, if you like, the kind of slightly cool hipster, rags to riches Bundesliga success story. Aside from that, probably hooliganism, I think, certainly in the English press, got some coverage after the Wende. Mm-hmm. So if you heard about East German clubs, you weren't hearing about them for football reasons, but because of the violence of supporters, including, of course, at Dynamo Berlin or BFC. So I think those were the dominant narratives. And I think a lot of the big names from the East German football past, some of which we'll talk about today, I'm sure, have been largely or completely forgotten because they're languishing much lower down the German football pyramid. But I think football, to me, football in East Germany, as in many sort of authoritarian dictatorships, is just this superb tool for analyzing the society that produces the football and the football culture. It's a space of conformity, obviously. East German football teams and clubs were generally sponsored by state organizations, so they were very close to state structures and state money. But at the same time, as we'll get on to talk about when we come to the history of BFC, football gives you it's one of these rare spaces where you can find pockets of autonomy, where you can protest politically without confronting the regime on major issues like the Berlin Wall, for example, or the Stasi's presence everywhere in society. So to me, football in East Germany was this very flexible space and very dynamic space. You know, the cliche, I think, of East German football, certainly, of East German sport in the Western world, the one I grew up with is the medal machine, steroids, the Olympic victories, you know, this very remorseless, well-oiled machine. If you look at the history of East German football for 10 minutes, it's chaotic, particularly in the early days. And out of that chaos comes just a ton of interesting stories.
And it's probably worth saying here as well that football is never the big priority for the regime in terms of a sport on where to showcase. It's much easier to showcase your country by winning gold medals in individual Olympic disciplines. And that's a lot of what the focus is on, which opens up space, I would assume, for football fans and football culture to articulate itself as well.
So, yeah, that's an important point to put in the mix.
The Berlin Wall falls on November 9th, 1989, as the name says.
My birthday, by the way.
What is that? Your birthday.
My birthday, by the way. Right.
Oh,
I was
so
fated to be a
that's
to be a
the
historian.
secret history that's been going on there. Okay.
Exactly.
As the name says, of course, it falls in Berlin, and the longtime serial champion of the East German Soccer League sits in Berlin as well. It's Berliner football club Dynamo. And after that political change, the club falls and is now in the BFC now fourth league, right?
Regional League, yeah.
Regional
Fourth
tier,
right? The regional,
yes,
the Northeast Regional League, yeah.
That club, its role for the regime, the opposition to that club, and also what happens to it after the country that is the German Democratic Republic is no more, gets absorbed into the Bundesrepublik, is, I think, an illustrative case for us to take a first look at what is going on behind that wall. Where are we at soccer football wise in 1989? What happens on the pitch in the weeks that the wall crumbles?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. It's funny how these sort of micro histories of sport are sort of played out in the shadow of big events, because there's actually a whole round of Oberliga fixtures. The Oberliga was the East German top division. There's a whole round of Oberliga fixtures the night before the wall collapses, so the 8th of November 1989. I think BFC draw 0-0 with Stahl-Eisenhüttenstadt in front of a pretty small crowd. And actually, even before the wall fell, I suppose it's worth saying to listeners that BFC's dominance of East German football was already beginning to be challenged. BFC had won the league title 10 years in a row, from 78 to 88. Then Dynamo Dresden, their main rivals, had come back to win the league and cup double in the next season. And so by the time we get to the regime crisis in the fall of 89, I mean, BFC are already a little bit in decline, but they're still one of East Germany's biggest clubs. And so on the eve of the wall falling, you know, they're kind of, I think, mid-table, slightly higher up mid-table in the Oberliga, but still on paper, the most powerful football club in East Germany.
If I'm on the stands on that day, let's say for the average visitor to those games the evening before the wall falls, would they have felt something's about to happen? Did you pick up on that?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, it's always, when regimes collapse, we can always read back history and look at signs and kind of join dots, I suppose. And as we'll no doubt go on to talk about, I think there are lots of interesting connections and parallels between the decline of BFC and the decline and fall of communism. I think there's a story and a linkage there. But yeah, I reckon if you and I were standing there watching what sounds like a pretty awful game, that 0-0 on the 8th of November, 89, I don't think we'd have known exactly what was around the corner. And I suppose even if we'd known about the fall of the regime, we might not have known exactly how that will play out in football, because as you mentioned, what eventually happens is really in football, as in the wider economy, the East is annexed to the West. And so when the Bundesliga, the unified Bundesliga eventually opens up in the 91-92 season, there are only 2 of 14 places given to teams from the East. So, yeah, even if we'd known East Germany was about to collapse, we might not have known exactly how imbalanced the system would be and how far big clubs like BFC were about to just fall through the system.
There's 10 years of serial championships here from the late 70s to the late 80s. How did that happen, and what does it have to do with politics? And why is this club in particular such a helpful lens to figure out what is happening with the country and with the regime and with the opposition to it as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so what's interesting in a way about this. So Dynamo Berlin, or BFC, were founded under that name in 1966. A previous version of the club goes back to 1954, when they'd essentially been transplanted from Dynamo Dresden to the capital city. There'd always been this pressure in East Germany to have a big team in the capital city of East Berlin. Obviously, given the nature of the division of Berlin, East Berlin is the capital city, as the sort of showcase of the German Democratic Republic. Having a decent football team there was always a big concern for the regime, and they struggled to find one for a while. In the 50s and 60s, Forgott Berlin, the army team, was successful. They won the league, played in Europe. But there wasn't really a sort of a fixed Berlin center of East German football, I think, until the later 70s, which, as you alluded to, is when BFC start winning league titles. And what's interesting here is that, and I've talked a bit about this in some of my writing, is it's interesting to think about why it took so long for BFC to become this behemoth in East German football. Because until 1978-79, which is the season they win the Oberliga for the first time, I think BFC had won one cup in the entire history of East German football, the FDGB Cup, which was the sort of the major cup competition in East Germany. So, you know, for a team sponsored by the East German secret police, the Stasi, you might wonder why it took so long for this club to be dominant. I think it's probably a bunch of factors at play there, but a lot of it relates to sort of rivalries within football. BFC's big rivals were another Dynamo team, Dynamo Dresden, from the other second major city, probably after Leipzig in the rest of the GDR. Dynamo Dresden were
maybe say the fact that they're also called Dynamo is we're talking about one system here. The Dynamo. Yeah. Is that too much to say, or
no? It's one system, but there are two strands in it, I think. So, and it's interesting to think about how history looks at the two Dynamo clubs, because Dynamo Dresden, I think, at least in East German times, and the attendance figures would bear this out, were a popular club. They had by far the highest attendance in East Germany. They had a wide range of local support. They were a club sponsored by the police organs of the GDR. They're probably associated more with the Volkspolizei, the sort of regular police, whereas, and I think this is the difference, BFC are much more associated with the Ministry for State Security, which we know commonly, obviously, as the Stasi. So they're two strands of the same organization, but the way they were seen, I think, is quite different. Not for everyone. I mean, I've talked to fans who said Dynamo is Dynamo, and they hated both the Dresden and Berlin versions of the team. But there was definitely much more antipathy towards BFC. And actually that predates them becoming really good. I mean, you can go back and look in the archives in the late 60s and early 70s. They were never a very popular team. And I think it is because they, more than any other club, were associated with the Stasi.
Other than the Dynamo system, are there other systemic issues that define football in the GDR at the time that we should know about, and that really are different by what's taking off in the West at the same time? So are there other systems and competing structures that are controlled by politics or by politically controlled companies at the time?
Yeah, I mean, in East Germany, like in a lot of the other communist states, Bulgaria, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, football clubs were sponsored by public institutions generally, or publicly owned companies, because of course there was, in theory at least, no private businesses in communist regimes. So those organizations would effectively be the sponsors of individual clubs. So you'd have Chemie for the chemicals industry, Chemie Leipzig with a big team there. You would have Dynamo for the secret police and police organizations. You would have Vorwärts or Forward for the army and military organizations.
Lok, of course, Lok Leipzig.
Lokomotive, exactly. Lok Leipzig for the railways. Stahl for the steelworks industry. And there'll be multiple clubs with that name, you know. So there's the Dynamo Schwerin, for example, as well as Dynamo Dresden and Berlin, right? So that was how East German football was structured, around those organizations. So they would provide the funds. There would be no Western-style transfer system. Players would be delegated from one club to another, and often that depended on which organization had the most clout. And of course, that was often Dynamo, who had influence everywhere in society.
So Dynamo Dresden is maybe the dominant club in the 1970s. It is the most popular one. Probably say it still is the most popular German club until today. It's in the third league now.
If we're excluding Red Bull Leipzig.
We are excluding Leipzig.
There we go. I thought we might be.
Yes. And the other Dynamo then takes over Berlin. You already mentioned players get delegated. How does this happen? Does somebody from the state show up in the clubhouse of Dynamo Dresden one day and says, hey, listen, our capital needs a good team. You all move up there. Is that how this works?
A little bit, I think. I mean, like the comment there is, you know, is a reference to this famous, if possibly apocryphal comment of Erich Mielke, the head of the Stasi, who apparently when the two Dynamos were playing a game in late 78, Dynamo Dresden versus Dynamo Berlin, walked into the Dresden dressing room and said, yes, the capital city needs a champion. And that's seen as the moment where things begin to swing towards Berlin. I mean, behind the scenes, there was a lot of sort of what I call local patriotism in some of my writing about East German football, where the delegating of players from one club to another was often a very hot political issue. So there was no transfer system. You didn't pay money to move X striker from, let's say, Lok Leipzig to BFC. This would be kind of haggled with behind the scenes. Lok officials would talk to Dynamo officials. And it often came down to, yes, who had the most political authority. And of course, as we know, by the 70s and 80s, the sort of secret police structure in East German society was huge and vast. It was probably the biggest organization in the country. So that meant that in sport, as elsewhere, Dynamo tended to have the most pulling power of players. And so it was very hard for smaller clubs to resist when they were basically requested or told that Dynamo Berlin would be taking their player. This happened like to Frank Pastor in the early 1980s, the striker who was delegated to BFC from, I think, Hallische FC Chemie. And there was protest from the fans. They didn't like to lose their star player. But, you know, they didn't really have a lot of choice in that. So, yes, the bigger teams, particularly BFC, tended to get delegated players. And another difference here is that most teams could get delegated players from their Bezirk or their area or region or county. BFC could basically get players from everywhere. I mean, they got them a lot from around Berlin and Cottbus and so on, but because of Dynamo's reach, they could kind of, if they wanted a player from anywhere in the Republic, they could usually get him. So that obviously built up a lot of resentment against BFC, both within other football clubs and also in their supporters' bases.
How does the supporter space of BFC, which exists before these nations, view all those things? What kind of club is this that becomes the serial champion? Not necessarily the most well-followed one around, and kind of has a grumbling history up to this point. So how does that club and its supporters latch on to what's happening here?
Yeah, I jokingly described BFC in a few places as Millwall with trophies. You know, if you think of the South London club Millwall, who kind of glory in the fact that no one likes us, we don't care. I mean, that's BFC really, I think. They're not a club with a large fan base, as you mentioned. If you look at the average Oberliga attendance, BFC are never at the top of the pile. And interestingly, their attendance declines as they're successful. I mean, you think about that, it's just a weird thing. From across this run of 10 straight league titles, their average league attendance is kind of roughly halves from about 15,000 to 8,000 per game. So they're not a big club. They have a supporter base, kind of in and around the sort of Mitte, Prenzlauer Berg area of Berlin in particular. Their local rivalry, if you like, is with Union Berlin, who at the time and later have been presented as this sort of dissident club in East German football, which is a little bit misleading, but not totally misleading. Union were not successful. They weren't as closely tied to big state institutions. So they probably had a bit of a larger fan base. So yeah, I mean, BFC were really, I would say, BFC and their supporters almost gloried in their unpopularity. There are clubs like this in most football cultures. That's why I mentioned the Millwall example, where the fact that nobody likes them is kind of part of the badge of identity. And I think BFC in the 80s were despised by everyone, except by their own fans. And they kind of, at least a certain base of the fans, like that role. And I think that also had to do with the Berlin identity, sort of East Berlin as the capital of the GDR, got better access to consumer goods, there was more chocolate and bananas. And so there was a very sort of an anti-zone attitude, that the inhabitants of the zone, the rest of the GDR, sort of provincial bumpkins in football and in wider society. So I think BFC was able to channel sort of a Berlin superiority across the rest of the GDR.
Is it true that tropical fruits and the access to tropical fruits plays a role in the terraces and the stands?
Absolutely, yeah. The stories of, taking those slightly manky-looking Cuban oranges to Karl-Marx-Stadt and throwing your leftover fruit, BFC fans throwing their leftover fruit at fans of rival teams. So, yeah, I think, that there's a really...
who didn't have access to that fruit.
Yeah, who didn't have access to that fruit, exactly.
So it's a gesture of pure arrogance. Yes. Yeah,
like the arrogance of it, exactly. It's almost like, I think you can draw some parallels to football teams in other countries. I mean, the one that always interests me, it's not identical, is Juventus in Italy, right? Like, obviously a much more popular team than BFC, but a team that has almost gloried in its unpopularity, that has had pretty controversial relationships with the referees and authorities over many decades, that are serial winners. So I think there are other cultures where you get a team like BFC, but of course, East Germany as a country and East German football are both pretty unique and strange. So it just creates this very strange microclimate where the best team are hated. Their national team players are booed when they play for the national team in Leipzig or in Dresden. There are hundreds and hundreds of letters flooding the state offices and newspapers about the team. And their own supporters are actually voting with their feet and not watching them as much. So it's quite a bizarre situation, I suppose. And in a way, it previews the sort of, the slightly unloved artificial creation of state-sponsored or state-owned clubs that we're seeing in a different environment today. It's kind of hard to create an organic fan culture from such an unpopular basis. And I think that was one of BFC's problems. It was a small club that was raised high because of its association with the Stasi. And that obviously triggered all sort of resentment.
Shout out to Peter Alegi here, who was on in the episode with 3 North American professors of soccer who will have the competing narrative on Juventus for you. So we have the Stasi Association, we have the location of the club in Berlin, which comes with certain geographic and economic privileges as well. In theory, the GDR is supposed to be a united state in which all kinds of old and ancient tribalisms have vanished. And yet you tell me that, the orange throwing in Karl-Marx-Stadt, which is now Chemnitz, the rivalries between Dresden, all these point to the persistence of regional identities and that they're persisting particularly on football grounds. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah, you think about the bitter rivalry between Dynamo Dresden and BFC. These are in theory brotherly organizations, 2 clubs from the Dynamo family, but they hated each other. And if you look at a lot of the sort of the hooligan clashes between fans of the two teams, or the chants. They're not so much about communism as such as they are about, Berlin pigs versus Saxon pigs or something along those lines, right? It's very much rooted in a much older sort of regional antipathy. East German football, the level of sort of local tribalism, I suppose, is just fascinating to read. And this drove the authorities crazy because, as you say, they wanted a unified, highly centralized socialist state in football as everywhere else. And what they got instead were all these warring factions, teams complaining about other teams poaching or trying to poach other teams' players, all in the guise of a nominally amateur football structure, which, of course, was amateur in the sense that they weren't paid professional footballers like the Bundesliga players, but it was also a sham amateurism. The players didn't really have jobs as policemen or as steel workers working 40 or 50 hours a week. It's this very lively world of local rivalries, and BFC come to epitomize that, really. And in a way, the most unifying element of East German football, I would say, certainly by the 70s and 80s, is BFC, in the sense that everybody hates them.
Yeah, it's a good segue, actually, because you have written that the resistance to BFC Dynamo was, in sheer numbers, the biggest resistance movement to the regime in East Germany, or at least to a proxy for the regime in East Germany, bigger than environmentalist movement, bigger than church movements, or than the peace movement. And it's true in sheer numbers. In a way, the league in itself is just set up to kind of revive those tribalisms that communism was supposed to undo, right? You have cities playing against each other, and you have local patriotism on full display, and you have the anti-Berlin and the anti-regime attitude in the stands. Other than the rivalry between the two Dynamos, Dresden and Berlin, are there any other examples of regime resistance in the stands that you would highlight?
You mean within football clubs?
Yeah, within clubs, at games, within the league.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways, really. I mean, I can think of a few from football in the 80s. I mean, one of them is the sort of creation of supporters clubs, is a good example of this. I mean, these were, like a lot of sort of socialist projects in society and culture, the state tried to run them, but fans tried to keep autonomy. So if you look at a lot of the supporters clubs created in the 80s at BFC, Dynamo Dresden, Rot-Weiss Erfurt, and so on and so forth, they're meant to register with the state. They're meant to be under state control, and you get free match tickets and so on. But in reality, there's this kind of almost sort of subcultural aspect to sports clubs where they kind of create their own environment and rules. They're wary of outsiders. And of course, there were Stasi informers trying to infiltrate these clubs. And there is also, I mean, they're not one and the same, but there is a bit of a crossover between some of the supporters clubs and some of the elements of hooliganism that are starting to come into East German football. And I mean, hooliganism is not specific to East Germany in the 80s, obviously. I mean, I grew up with it in England where it was probably much worse. But I do think...
Well, where does fan culture find its East German fan culture find its inspiration then? Is that seen by the regime as a Western kind of influence, bad Western influence, that you have hooligan factions in the stadium? Or is this indigenously East German? What's going on here?
Well, certainly the way the regime would have portrayed it would have been that this was a Western sickness imported. You know, you did not have hooliganism or violence in a socialist society. So any remnants of it were, imports from sort of capitalism. And so, for the authorities, the football authorities, I mean, again, as more widely with East Germany, there was this ambiguous relationship with the West. On the one hand, class enemy, bitter rival. On the other hand, it was your measuring stick, and it was the same in football, So these German football authorities could criticize the Bundesliga and the mercenary capitalism of professional footballers in the West, but that was who they were competing with on European football stages, right? Increasingly by the 70s and 80s. So there's definitely indigenous elements to East German football culture, to sort of what I've called the invented tradition of the factory club. You know, you build these clubs after World War II, and like any club that's built up, it develops a fan base and fan songs and cultures and identities. But I would say the measuring stick for most East German football fans, administrators, even players, is not Poland or Bulgaria. It's obviously the West, and particularly West Germany, which was widely accessible by radio, increasingly by television, and by European competition. I mean, East and West German clubs by the 70s and 80s are starting to play each other pretty regularly in in UEFA competitions as well.
You have a number of great examples in your book of fans of other teams complaining to the state about BFC. What do these fans write, and do they have any leg to stand on?
Well, those are two big questions. Well, the first thing to say is they complain in pretty large numbers. I mean, it's hard to know exactly. But I know, for example, that after the 1985 cup final in East Germany, which was Dynamo Dresden versus BFC, Dresden win after extra time, 3-2, but pretty much despite the referee, let's just put it that way. There was actually an investigation into this game, which basically proved how biased the refereeing was towards the Berlin team. There were at least 700 letters written immediately after that game to the authorities. And I think we can see that as pretty reliable in terms of the volume of complaints. Certainly by the mid-1980s about BFC, they were pretty high. In East Germany, of course, you didn't have free elections. You didn't have free elections to football clubs any more than you did to political parties. So how do you protest? A petition or Eingabe was probably the best way in East Germany to register your dissenting opinion about something. And certainly if you look at football petitions from the 80s, and East German citizens petitioned the state about everything, basically, BFC was the number one topic by far. So as I said before, it's a bit of a unifying element of GDR football culture in the 80s is we all hate BFC. So yeah, there are lots of petitions starting to flood in. The complaints about BFC are along the lines of it's not a level playing field, the competition. And there were a number of strands to that, one of which was BFC had preferential treatment when it came to the delegation of players, i.e. they could cherry pick the best players. But the main one, the most controversial one, the one that comes up in most of the petitions is the referees. There's a widespread belief that BFC benefit from dodgy refereeing decisions, dodgy penalties, dubious handballs, red cards for the opposing teams, inopportune moments, that kind of thing. So that's the big element of the story. And one thing that the petitioners bring up regularly is, look how shit BFC are in European competition. When you take away the domestic referees, BFC aren't very good. That was the line of argument, because BFC famously struggled in European competition. Their best effort in the European Cup, the old Champions League, was quarterfinal. They got knocked out by a few fairly middle-ranking European teams. And they generally struggled to punch their weight in European competition. So the petitioners pointed out that when the referees are not on BFC's side, they weren't actually very good. So yeah, that was the thrust, I think. The main thrust of the petitions was anger about preferential treatment towards BFC, particularly the behavior of referees, which opened up a whole can of worms in East German football at this time.
Which brings us back to the question, do they have a leg to stand on? It seems to me that no doubt there are dodgy refereeing decisions, but is there actually any proof that these are state ordered? Yeah.
Well, the short answer to that is no, there isn't. And BFC fans will happily tell you that there was no smoking gun. There's no state-sponsored decree. I mean, I've looked through lots of archives on East German football, and I've never found a single document that says dear comrades, by my order, BFC will win the next 10 league titles, signed Eric Mielke.
Well,
There's
that's
nothing
the kind
like
of thing
that.
you're looking for, right?
Yeah. No, that would be good. That would answer all our questions. It would make for a shorter podcast, though. I think the short answer is no, that there's not an order there's not a state order that says BFC will win everything and dominate football. I think it's more subtle than that. And I think one thing to say is, and it's worth saying this, because I'm sure you'll have maybe a few BFC listeners, is the BFC had a good team, right? They had a good youth development program. Now, of course, they had inbuilt biases and attractions. They had more money, but they developed lots of brilliant players in the 70s and 80s. They had an excellent youth training system, like many East German clubs did. So, it's not completely shocking that they came to the top of East German football. And on the refereeing decisions, it's interesting. I mentioned in the start of the essay we've talked about before that I wrote a few years ago about BFC and the end of communism, the game in March 1986 between Lok Leipzig and BFC. They were at the time going head to head for the Oberliga title. It was basically a title decider towards the end of the season. The game is level going into the last minute or the last minute plus 8. And the referee awards BFC a pretty soft penalty. Now, if you look at the footage from that game, especially in our modern climate of football, you can see how that penalty is given, and it probably often would be given today in the Bundesliga or the Premier League. It's not a completely outrageous call, but it's soft enough and it happens often enough that fans understandably think, well, there's no smoke without fire. And so I think they do have a leg to stand on. And interestingly, the DFV, which was the East German Football Association, privately at least, conceded the same point. They actually did a big investigation into the 84-85 Oberliga season, which basically found that BFC were 3 times less likely to get yellow and red cards than their major rivals, as one example. And
were those investigations done internally? And
yes, they're internal investigations.
They only got public recently, right? As the archive.
Yeah, these are things we find out about after the fact. What you find out about at the time is that referees become the scapegoat. So after the cup final in 85, where 14 of the 17 bad decisions, which was already a high number, went against Dynamo Dresden, they did what they did after the Lok Leipzig game the following March, which is suspend the referee or, move them to referee lower league games for a year. So the referees actually become a bit of the scapegoat.
Well, why would the referees be doing this then, if there's no direct order? What kind of dynamic, no pun intended, does the regime develop for referees to be acting this way?
Well, one thing to say is that Stasi coverage of football was widespread. And so throughout football, players, coaches, administrators, but also referees, the Stasi had informers. So a number of the Oberliga referees worked for the Stasi. Now, that phrase implies something that isn't always true. You can be various levels of informer, and it often wasn't the kind of treasonous or traitorous role that it might sound like now to our ears. But they were, in other words, some of the referees were fairly low-level informers, but nonetheless, they had this relationship of dependency with the Stasi. So I think that's one thing. Some of the referees were informers. Another thing is, as I say, overseas travel. If you referee in the correct way that the regime likes, you're going to get the UEFA gigs. You're going to be able to travel to West Germany or to the Netherlands or elsewhere to referee prestigious European games. You're more
eat
likely
better oranges and take things for your
seriously.
family. There was a thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's some of the protests from Dynamo Dresden's about one referee after a bad game with BFC where, he'll get a new car now. And so that kind of thinking, that there were material benefits for referees who played the game. So, yeah, I think there are motivations for referees. And, the GDR is a very hierarchical, authoritarian state, to state the obvious. And so for many figures in football authority, it was easy to just keep your head down and make sure you didn't upset the balance. And so, yeah, whether that's deliberate or not, the end result is BFC do get the benefit of refereeing decisions. And disproportionately so, and that certainly helps them to win these 10 consecutive league titles. I don't think it's the whole story. That they were a good team anyway, and they beat some decent teams in Europe. They weren't, a complete fraud or anything, but I think the refereeing plus this wider inbuilt advantages in the system certainly helped BFC to dominate for a decade.
Let me a bit more critically investigate your thesis before, which was that the anti-BFC movement is in a way is the largest, numerically largest resistance movement in the GDR. If indeed that team then was able to win 10 consecutive titles, and as you told me earlier, the night before the Berlin Wall falls, you may not have picked up that something big was about to happen if you attended the game of that team the night before. How does the anti-BFC atmosphere that you've clearly demonstrated translate into an actual mood for regime change? I mean, is this just a bunch of grumpy football fans is one thing, but to actually, in your mind, politicize the issue and make you more likely to join a protest in the street or whatever it be, that's still another step to take. So how do those anti-BFC atmosphere and the anti-regime activism go together, if at all? Is there a clear connection?
No, I don't think there's a clear or direct connection. What I would say is that everything in the GDR was political. This was a regime that politicized everything, and it certainly politicized football. So East German authorities made football a political space, whether the fans liked it or not. And let's be honest, most football fans, just like me, I'd rather think less about politics in football. But of course, today, as before, we have to think about the politics of football all the time. Sometimes we might just want to enjoy it, but it's not possible. So I think the first thing to say is that the East German authorities politicized football. Secondly, anti-BFC sentiment is sentiment directed against the football team of the most powerful secret police organization in the world. If you look at it per capita, the Stasi. So I think I don't think there's, as I've said before, I don't think there's any straight line from people being pissed off with BFC to people necessarily climbing on the wall and helping to knock it down on the glorious night of the 9th of November, 1989. I think what the BFC story tells us is a sort of the creation of, I think you mentioned the word grumbling football fans. I think grumbling's not a bad word there, actually, because if you look at East Germany in the 80s generally, there's a lot of grumbling going on. And a lot of the complaints look quite petty, a football team's winning unfairly. Look at the quality of the jeans or the clothing that's been sent by the state-owned company, or how long I'm waiting for X or Y. They look like quite petty, trivial, everyday complaints, but they're all speaking to this wider disillusionment with socialism that I think is manifested in football as in other areas of society. So I don't think we can just say that, BFC, anti-BFC protests, led to or caused the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's obviously, probably a bit of a provocative stretch. But I do think of all the protest sort of cultures and movements in East Germany in the 80s, this one had the biggest traction. It's been discussed probably the least. And of course, that's partly because it was less directly political. But it was the one that spoke, I think, to this underlying disillusionment with East German socialism, which was meant to create a level playing field. And in football, as in other areas of society, I think the frustration in East Germany more widely in the 80s is that equality with a good basis standard of living was looking further away than ever. And so I think BFC's sort of successes were emblematic of that. Which is not to say that, like loads of football supporters were at the forefront of protest, as they were, for example, in Egypt in 2011, where football supporters play, major direct roles. Same in the Yugoslav civil war as well. Football supporters play roles. Red Star and Dynamo. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think there's anything like that going on here. I think it's a bit more subtle and it's a bit more indirect.
Right.
But I think, if you look at the downfall of the GDR and the downfall of BFC, it's just fascinating parallels there, right? These unaccountable, uber powerful organizations that seemingly hold everything in their hands, almost overnight reduced to shells of what they'd been, to kind of the offices of the Stasi being ransacked, BFC plummeting through the divisions, falling into insolvency, flogging all their best players to the West. So, that decline of the of the BFC institution and the Stasi East German institution, I think there's some really interesting parallels there. So
I don't sing their eulogy. I think you did kind of a metaphor there right before between what's happened on a football pitch, which is supposed to be fair, and the ideal utopia of a socialist state, which is also supposed to be fair, and both are not.
No.
And if football means a lot for your life, and you see that in the system we are living in, things that are supposed to be fair aren't, at least in this one instance, it makes it much more thinkable that they may not be in other areas of life as well. And the window opens to say, wait a second, maybe the system we live in is not what they're billing this as.
Yeah, absolutely.
Evidence is on the pitch in a way.
Yeah.
That dissatisfaction rather suddenly breaks through, of course, in the late 80s, and we won't recap the exact series of events, but the wall comes down. The German Democratic Republic is no more. The borders open up, and the regions that made up the GDR are integrated into the Federal Republic of Germany. What does that mean to the Oberliga, to the league system, and especially to Dynamo?
I mean, it's basically the end for all of those things, really. The Oberliga plays its last season in 1990-91, and effectively that season is a sort of a dry run for which Oberliga teams will make it to the first post-unification Bundesliga in the following season.
How many are allowed to make it into the first?
So only 2 go directly into the new unified Bundesliga, and neither of those teams is BFC. So
those teams were Dynamo Dresden and is it Hansa?
Yeah, it would be Hansa, right? Because they win the 1991 league. That's right. Yeah. So 1991 would have been Hansa and Dynamo Dresden. I think BFC actually really struggled that year, which, because they were already starting to lose some of that state support in 1991. I think they finished around about 10th in the league. And so so from the very beginning of unification football, BFC are on the back foot. And at the time, the West German football clubs, they're, hovering like vultures to hoover up all of the many great players from East Germany, your Matthias Sammers, your Andreas Toms, they're all on the shopping list of West German clubs.
And that's true even for Hansa Rostock and Dresden, who do make
it. That's true for all of them.
There's a lot of talent too.
Yeah, absolutely. Which means, we don't want to get too much into the sort of Bundesliga history of ex-GDR teams, but the end result is that they generally find it hard, to get to the Bundesliga, and then, of course, to stay there, with odd exceptions like Energie Cottbus and Hansa, and more recently Union Berlin. But generally speaking, that sets a pattern that hasn't been broken since then. And for the GDR's biggest clubs, so I think Dresden, I can't remember exactly when, but they're relegated from the Oberliga, from the Bundesliga very quickly.
Yeah.
And other big clubs, clubs who've been playing major European games, European finals in some cases, like FC Magdeburg, BFC, of course, Lokomotive Leipzig. These were big East German clubs who played in big European Cup and UEFA Cup games.
Yep.
Suddenly found themselves sort of forced into professionalism for which they had zero experience or expertise. Their best players stripped away. Often found themselves in the hands, this happened with Dynamo Dresden, of pretty unscrupulous Western investors. And, the end result is the bottom falls out of East German football financially, in terms of players and structures. The structures disappear. The East German FA, the DFB, becomes a regional affiliate of the DFB, the German Football Association. And so, that's really what happens to East German football. And BFC is probably the most extreme example of this decline and fall, but it's happening everywhere.
How extreme is it? What happens to Dynamo after the wall comes down? The last Oberliga season sees them renamed.
Mm-hmm.
We're at the bottom, but not quite relegated yet.
Yeah.
What happens to them?
Yeah. So they try and do a bit, I guess, a bit like the SED, the ruling party in East Germany, which tried to rebrand itself as the PDS, the Party of Democratic Socialism. BFC get rid of the Dynamo name and they become for a while FC Berlin, which, by the way, many hardcore BFC fans hated.
Yes,
the very of course. Started to the
and
very
the Dynamo D is gone from the emblem too. It's the Berlin Bear.
Exactly, the Berlin Bear comes in, the new club badge. Dynamo fall through the system and the leagues pretty rapidly. I'm trying to remember when the lowest point for them is, but they get down into the sort of, the lower levels of East German football, well beyond professional football, which I guess now in Germany would include at least the third tier of German football. I mean, even today, BFC have made a bit of a comeback, but they're still in the fourth tier of German football. And I mean, it's pretty staggering, the scale of decline. And if you just look at, there's this famous quote from Simon Cooper, the British football journalist, who talks about going to a BFC game around this time. And he says, I mean, the crowd's tiny, but he says there were so many hooligans, he would call it the lunatic majority. So the only ones really going, I think, to BFC games in the early 90s are, a hardcore few, some of whom are associated with hooliganism, which of course is the beginning of the sort of post-Wende association of East German football. I think sometimes quite unfairly as being only about hooliganism, as if there's no hooliganism in the Bundesliga. So I mean, BFC lose all their best players. They lose the structures to develop youth talent. They obviously lose the money that they had from Dynamo as a supporting organization. And I think all of the leading East German clubs fall at least into the regional league at some point, and BFC's road back is probably a bit harder than any of the others. I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that I don't think BFC have ever got higher than the third tier since the Wende. Yep. So they've never kind of made the kind of comeback that a Union Berlin has done, right?
Attendance falls through the floor as well, right? And only recovers, 10 years into the new republic.
Across East Germany, attendances just fall through the floor. And I don't think East German football's ever really recovered from the economic blows, but also the sort of loss of prestige. 1 minute you're playing, like BFC were playing Werder Bremen in the European Cup in, I think, 88, 89. It all went badly, but still, they were playing top teams in European competitions. And a couple of years later, you're playing in front of 80 people in Greifswald. I mean, it's a huge come down, and it nurses resentments that then probably feed into that quite extreme element in some East German clubs post-Wende culture, hooliganism and violence, but that also probably draw fans away from those clubs. I mean, if you look, I mean, one of the reasons I think RB Leipzig become RB Leipzig and not RB somewhere else is the mess that is Leipzig football in the 90s. They can't organize or sustain a club, a tradition club, as we would say in German, to kind of rally around the team, to rally around people in the city. And so, the space is left for this artificial entity to come in and, take the stage in which was, originally the site built by the East German authorities and become the dominant Leipzig team. I mean, that's partly as a consequence of the Wende and the mess that it made of East German football. Now, that wasn't entirely the fault of the West. That was also, bad administrators and bad practices in East German football. But, I think there's a good what-if story there for sure.
And nostalgia is an option out. And there certainly is plenty of that at BFC for a long time that both maybe saves the club, helps it survive, but also hampers its development and its growing into a new age. But that would probably be for another episode.
Yeah, we could. I was going to start talking to you about that, but then maybe we'll save that for another day, because that is the two sides of nostalgia. I think is a really fascinating story of football culture, anyway. But particularly in the case of East Germany, where it's partly this proud identity, but it's partly a very problematic identity in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, for now, we have a story.
We have a story
that, of how football can foreshadow political developments, can mirror them in some ways, or can just plant some small seeds
Yeah, I think all of those things apply in the story of BFC and the end of the GDR. It's not, it's not a direct cause and effect, but there's no doubt that the cultural environment around East German football predicts or foreshadows or foretells some of the things that happened in 1989 and 1990. Absolutely.
For those who haven't looked at the show notes yet, I'll name the book again. The People's Game, Football State and Society in East Germany. Out in a new edition. When did the new edition come out now? I have the old one.
I've got I don't know, the paperback came out, it's probably a few years old now, but anyway, okay. It's still, it's, hopefully some
Cambridge University Press.
That's
still
right.
Goodbye, and you've done work since then as well. What are you working on right now?
Yeah, I've since then I've written a global history of football called Contested Fields, which of course mentions German football a lot. That came out in 2020. I am now working on a social history of Liverpool Football Club from sort of modern Liverpool. And so this is, you might say, a vanity project because I am a lifelong Liverpool fan. But there's of course much German content in that, given Liverpool's current managers. So that's what I'm working on. That's a book project that should be hopefully completed when I'm on research leave in the next year. So enjoying writing about that.
Wonderful. All the best for that. And thank you for the time here.
My pleasure, Philip.
I feel like there's probably at least 2 more episodes that we could wring out of some of the strands we've pulled on so far.
Happy to come back another time.
That'd be wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much for the story and for uncovering a kind of German football that really isn't very firmly established in public memory of soccer fans at all. Thank you.
Cheers, Philip.
As things stand right now, I can't quite promise the sequence of the next episode, but there's quite a few things in the work. For one, I'm interested in the question of how my own home country of Austria used and abused football and footballers to kind of create its own myth after the Nazi period. The Homeless World Cup is an event that takes place every couple of years around the world, and this last one happened just this summer in San Francisco, so there will definitely be an episode with the founder of what is the Homeless World Cup. There is the question of how European players fare when they transfer to America to play in college, which is a very different system and culture of soccer than they would have back home. And there's 2 more German-centric episodes in the works as well, one on St. Pauli and one on Bayern Munich and its Jewish past. So quite a bit on the docket, lots of pieces of the puzzle moving, but plenty of interesting stuff to look forward to. And I look forward to you joining me on the journey as well. Thank you for listening today.